Chapter 6. He decided that since it was all my fault, I had to go. If I could be removed, he would get his position and his status back. He talked with his few friends left about how he planned to murder me. He told them he had ordered a stun gun from the USA, and he would use it to knock me out, tie me up, and put me in the trunk of a car, drive me out into a deep forest, tie me to a tree, and then torture me to death whilst filming it. Personally, from March or maybe April until August 1993, I ignored him completely. Then one day in August he called me on the phone and with a sugar-sweet voice suggested that I should come visit him and bring the contracts with his record company, now with new distributors, that I had not yet signed. Later, the same day, he called again, but his childhood friend Snorri was there in my apartment and picked up the phone. The tone was a completely different one. He told him that I had to go, and Snorri waved me over to let me listen directly to what he had to say. So I heard it from his own mouth, we could say, that he intended to get rid of me permanently. He wanted to use the unsigned contracts to lure me over to his place, and then he would get rid of me. He needed me to sign those contracts first, though, because otherwise he would not be able to cash in on my music. I guess he intended to create another myth around me, like he had done to Dead, to promote his own band. Snorri was living in my apartment temporarily until he found some place to live, so the fact that he picked up the phone would not have been that strange. But the fact that Euronymous assumed that I was not there or could not hear what he said is very strange. Maybe he just trusted his childhood friend. I do not know. He certainly had no reason to, though. A lot of things are strange in real life, for sure. Snorri, too, was fed up with Euronymous, but he was still his friend and even the new guitarist in Mayhem. His loyalties were nowhere, though. It is very hard to understand what happened in his head at the time. He was disloyal to everyone, even to himself. After the conversation, I was naturally upset and wondered what to do. We had already rented 3 VHS videos from a rental shop nearby and had pizzas in the oven, and another friend was supposed to come over later that evening. I decided to sign the contracts and simply hand them over, when he was not expecting it and thus was not prepared to execute his plan to murder me, to take away any and all excuses he had to contact me or have anything at all to do with me. Royalties from the Bergen albums would come directly from the distribution company, by the way. I was going to leave for his place on my own, all alone, that same evening. When the third guy showed up, he and Snorri went down to take a smoke. When they came back up, Snorri said that he wanted to come up with me. He had some new riffs to show Euronymous. He was in his band, after all. I thought that it was a bit strange, but had no objections. So we left for Oslo that evening, the 9th of August, 1993. The third guy stayed behind to watch the films we had after already rented and to eat the pizzas. It took somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of driving to get there, I may add, and we took turns driving. Now, this is where things get complicated, because according to the police, I left Bergen for Oslo to murder Euronymous. According to police interviews, Snorri and the third guy planned, whilst smoking outside my apartment, for the latter to use Snorri's credit card in Bergen during the night to give him an alibi. Honestly, I have no idea if this is true or not, as I was not there and thus knew nothing about it. But he forgot to give him the credit card, so that never happened. Also, without Snorri or me knowing of it, the third guy claimed, in police interviews, he put on my clothes and walked around in Bergen so that people would notice him and think it was me. This he actually did, however, probably not for that reason. In reality, he had done similar things before in an attempt to get female attention. Yeah, his idea of hitting on women was to pretend he was me. I'm not sure if I should be proud of the fact that I was popular with the other sex, so much that other guys pretended to be me in order to get their attention, or if I should be ashamed of belonging to the same species as individuals who did such things. In any case, I really do not think he did that in an attempt to give me an alibi. Oh, and I knew about this, because one time in 1993, some girls came up to me and said about him, "That guy is pretending to be you." They too thought it was really weird, especially considering that I was actually present. Another time some other girls told me the same, only he had done it when I was not present. "He does it all the time," they told me. Yeah, what a clown world. And why did I keep him around as a friend after that? Good question. Back to the evidence in the murder case. Further, they claimed, in police interviews, that Snorri came along to call the doorbell and talk in the speaker when we arrived at the apartment complex where Euronymous lived, because they argued that he would never have let me in, considering his plans to murder me and all, if I had showed up in the middle of the night. But he never did call the doorbell or talk to him through the calling system. I did. And he did let me in, so... They also claimed, still in police interviews, that I planned to show up and just walk up to Euronymous and cut his throat, but I never did. And the knife I did have on me, and that I did use to kill him, was blunt. It was like a small stiletto, with a 3-inch blade, I would say. Pointy, but completely blunt. It would have been close to impossible to cut his throat with that knife. It does sound cruel, though, and probably did make an impression on the jury. But this was it. This was the murder plan. That was never carried out, and that would have not been possible to carry out either with the knife I had on me, so... Even if this plan had been real, I really should not have been convicted for premeditated murder, because I never carried out the assumed plan to murder him. Let me elaborate a bit here about that. According to the law, if you plan to shoot some guy, and when you show up at his place, he attacks you before you have the time to shoot him, before you even draw your pistol, and then whilst fighting him, you draw your pistol and actually shoot him anyway, this is not first-degree murder, because you did not carry out your plan to murder him. This is just intentional homicide / second-degree murder. And if your life was in danger, if he tried to kill you in this situation, you can even claim self-defense. Like I've said over and over again, and just like Snorri told the police in interviews with them, something went wrong. This is what I had told him, Snorri, after I had killed Euronymous when we left his place, got into the car and drove away. Now, you can think that something went wrong with the plan, but in reality, something went wrong when I showed up. I called the doorbell. He replied from the 4th floor, I think, in his apartment complex. In the speaker, he told me, "It is a bit late." It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, "I have brought the contracts." He said nothing, but beeped me in. Snorri stayed behind to finish his cigarette downstairs because he knew he was not allowed to smoke in Euronymous' apartment. Because that makes sense, right? You go to a guy with plans to murder him, but you respect his policy of no smoking in his apartment? When I had climbed the stairs, he stood there, still in his underwear, holding the door open. He pretended that everything was all fine between us. He went into his living room, and I handed him the contracts. He looked at them to see if they were signed. They were. Things were not all fine between us, though, and I was probably a lot more aggressive than I should have been. When I told him to basically fuck off and stay away from me, pointing my finger at his face, he panicked. He dropped the contracts and kicked me in the chest. I easily pushed him back and in the process threw him to the ground. For a moment, both of us considered what to do next. And when he looked at a visible kitchen knife in the kitchen and suddenly got up and ran for it, I quickly fished up my own blunt stiletto knife from a pocket, moved to block his access to the knife in the kitchen, and stabbed him. Half-heartedly, I have to say. Because this was pretty dramatic, and to me new move after all. He had then charged for his bedroom instead, where I believed that he had a shotgun and also the stun gun he had ordered from the USA. If I recall correctly, police investigation showed that he had a shotgun but not a stun gun. It had not yet arrived from the USA at that point. So as I saw it, my life was still in danger. I naturally assumed that even though he was not prepared for it right there and then, he intended to carry out his plan to murder me. So my life was indeed in danger. Instead of trying to get to his bedroom, he took a right turn and ran out into the hallway. I managed to stab him at least once on the way out in his upper left shoulder. This time I did not hold back. I had crossed that line. Blood would spray from his shoulder when I would pull the knife out again, and I was surprised by just how bloody it was. When he opened the door, we saw Snorri's face lit up by the light from his own lighter. After he had finished his smoke, he had climbed the stairs, but was not really sure about where exactly the apartment was, so he had climbed up one story too much and ended up in the attic. So he had walked back down, and since the light was out in the hallway, he lit his lighter in an attempt to read the door sign to see if this was the right apartment. He was absolutely shocked by what he saw and looked like a terrified ghost, still with his lighter lit in front of his face as we both ran past him. According to the police interviews, Snorri completely panicked and had a blackout at that point and did not remember anything else until I later on, several flights further down, asked him, "Are you okay?" "No." "Går det bra?" Euronymous continued to run, but then stopped to make a stand one flight down. Maybe he thought that Snorri would help him. Personally, I believed that, because I had no idea where his loyalties were. So I had one enemy in front of me and one potential enemy behind me. Euronymous tried to punch me, but I blocked his punches with the hand that held the knife. So in effect, when he swung his fists at me, all it did was to land a stab from my knife to his arm, bicep. Snorri, still frozen in front of the front door, probably still with his lighter lit. Euronymous then made a run for it again and started screaming, "Help!" and banging the doors that he passed on the way down, as well as the walls. "Help!" I followed and kept stabbing him in the one part of his body that I could reach as we ran downwards. His upper shoulders. I was still worried about Snorri helping him. Again, the amount of blood spraying the walls when I pulled the knife out after an attack was surprising. It was a lot more bloody than any horror film I had ever seen depicting it. When he reached the first floor, he smashed a glass lamp on one of the walls, probably unintentionally, and probably because he was banging the walls to wake up the other residents in the apartment block to get them to help him. And he then slipped and fell into the shards of glass, now all over the floor. He literally landed in his underwear in a pile of glass shards. The autopsy report claimed that the cuts he got from this were inflicted by me, including one under his foot sole, as if I had stabbed him under his foot, which of course made no sense whatsoever, but their job was to demonize me, so. "You have a cut under your foot sole? Could it come from the glass shards on the floor where you later got up and stood barefooted? Or is it a knife cut from the guy you fight with? Hard to tell, right? Sigh. 23 stab wounds, brah. No, but understand that people who fight for their lives are filled to the brim with adrenaline that will keep them going even after they have received wounds that will later on lead to their death. And yeah, some people can die from a fall from a chair, whilst others can survive being shot 3 times at point-blank range with a .375 Magnum revolver. This is just how things are, whether we like it or not. Anyhow, I slipped past him and readied myself for more melee. Euronymous was trying to get back up on his feet. When Snorri came running down the stairs, I immediately understood that he was no threat to me, as he just ran past me with a completely pale face and panic in his eyes. This is the moment I woke him up from his panic by saying, "Are you okay?" He was pretty far from being okay. In the meanwhile, Euronymous had gotten back up on his feet, and because I was standing in the stairs leading down, I was a little bit under him, and he tried to kick me again. He missed, and I countered by taking a step up and thrusting my blunt knife through his forehead. He immediately collapsed, fell down to a sitting position, and exhaled, like people often do when they die. His eyes rolled backwards. The knife was still stuck in his forehead, so I jerked it out, and doing so no longer held his dead body up in a sitting position, and he slowly fell forwards as I turned and ran, worried about Snorri, who had the car keys, and who looked like he was in total panic. What if he took the car and left me there, all covered in blood? As I ran, I heard a large bang behind me as Euronymous' dead body rolled down the stairs and landed on the flight below. If the other residents had not heard anything before, they sure would have heard that, I thought to myself, and ran towards the car. I caught up with Snorri by the car, quickly took the keys from him, and told him to drive back to Bergen. Personally, I was covered in blood all over my upper body, so I figured it would not be too smart for me to do the driving. I got into the back seat and laid down and told him to drive. After a short while, I realized that Snorri was lost in Oslo. He had no idea where to go, and in fact was on the way to Trondheim, his own hometown, and not even remotely near Bergen. I threw the knife out the window on the highway northwards and told him to take a left turn in order to find a way back to Bergen. We found a way leading to Holmfoss, which could lead us to Bergen later on. Before we got there, we stopped by a lake, and I washed most of the blood off me. I tied rocks into the bloodied clothes and threw them into the lake. That is, I literally swam into the lake and dropped the bundles on the deep side of the lake. They sank deep into the mud on the lake floor, and most were never found. When Snorri later on showed them the lake, the police used divers, but found only one single t-shirt with the text, "Norway, land of the Vikings." There was no technical evidence to be collected from it. There was no evidence it was mine even. Jorn Eng had thankfully, on one occasion, left one of his creator sweatshirts on the floor in the back of my car, and I was happy to find it there, all dirty and stepped on the floor in the back. And I put it on. "Pleasure to kill," it said, ironically. From then on, I did the driving, and we figured we should tell the third guy still in my apartment that something had gone wrong, and that he should go back home before the police showed up. Naturally, I had no idea whether or not I had been seen in Oslo or anything, and there was no reason for him to be involved in this. We stopped by a phone booth in Honfoss, but there was a whole gang of teens there, so we continued on until we found another one. Snorri went out of the car and tried to make the call when a patrol car drove past us. The cop looked at us as if we had done something wrong. Snorri came back, telling me that the phone did not work. In hindsight, I guess the teens we saw at the other phone booth had broken it intentionally, and someone had called the cops. And therefore, the cop looked at us that way, standing next to the broken phone booth. The teens had already moved on to the next phone booth to break that one too. At this point, of course, I intended not to get caught and expected no justice, so I told Snorri to hurry back into the car and drive off. I could see the cop turn around his patrol car behind me 180 degrees, 200 or so yards up the road to drive back to us. If a cop had stopped us at this point, there would be no doubt that I would get caught for having killed Euronymous. So I figured I could just as well try to get away. After the first turn we came to, I stepped on the throttle and drove like a madman and lost the cop. Honestly, I do not even know if he tried to pursue us, because we left in a hurry after the first turn we came to and never looked back. But lose him we did. But of course, now they truly must have been on to us, I thought, and maybe he had recorded the license plate or something. Since Snorri really had done nothing wrong, I asked him if I should not let him off at a train station in Gol on the way to Bergen, so that he could safely get a train instead. I was sure that they would have a roadblock or something further ahead at one point. There was no reason for him to get into trouble too. I was alone on this after all. He turned the offer down. We stopped later on when we found another phone booth that actually worked, and Snorri told the third guy that something went wrong in Oslo, and I think also Euronymous is dead. But nothing happened. I just drove all the way home. No cops, no roadblocks, nothing. When I finally came home and hit the rack after having driven to Oslo, northwards towards Trondheim, then southwestwards toward Honfoss, and finally back to Bergen again, I was of course dead tired. Shortly after the phone call waking me up and some journalists asking about my opinion on the murder of Euronymous, I was of course still exhausted and dead tired, and told him that I really don't want to talk about that right now. The next day, the newspapers gloatingly wrote that Varg Vikernes is crushed by the news of the death of his friend Euronymous. Sigh. Then after some hours, Hellhammer called me and asked me directly if I had anything to do with the murder of Euronymous. He kind of understood already, which of course made sense, considering that Euronymous had plans to murder me. So why would I not have defended myself and actually killed him before he could carry out his plan that I am sure Hellhammer knew too perfectly well? I, of course, had to lie and said no, whereupon he replied that he could not care less about what had happened. He then literally said, "More money for me," from the album that was to be released. Yeah, those who knew Euronymous were all pretty fed up with him and his BS. According to police interviews, the third guy in my apartment, when Snorri called him, took steps to make the neighbors believe I was there. He used my noisy electric mechanical typewriter to write meaningless gibberish, but to make it sound to the neighbors as if I was there writing. He also played loud music. It is not at all clear whether or not he did this before or after Snorri called him. So no, this proves nothing, and playing loud music in the evening and night is not exactly something metalheads never do commonly, and for other reasons. Come to think of it, I think I actually, before I drove home to sleep, first drove to the third guy's apartment to see if he was okay and not arrested, and told him the same, namely that something went wrong in Oslo. Again, I must stress that ending up in a fight where you kill somebody quite correctly can be described as something went wrong. This is normally not a situation where things are all fine. It does not have to mean that some murder plan went wrong. The cops found my signed contracts on the floor in Euronymous' apartment, so Of course they understood that I was involved, but there was no evidence against me. They quickly moved their investigation to Bergen and started interviewing people in the scene, with a focus on Snorri, the third guy, and me. I told them I had mailed the contracts to Euronymous, the date written on them making this unlikely because it takes some time for letters to reach their destination after all. We're simply wrong. I had no idea what date it was. I, correctly, argued, and had just written something more or less correctly. They asked me if I normally wrote the address on the envelope, but I understood where they wanted with this, so I said sometimes and sometimes not. You can, of course, see the print from a pen on the letter inside if you write the address on the envelope with the letter inside. There were, of course, no such prints on those contracts. As a curiosity, I can add that we normally greeted each other with Heil Hitler and a fascist salute at that time, and I also did that to the cops when I was called for an interview. They were a little bit distressed by it. One time I was called for an interview at an exact hour, but when I came there, they were not yet done with the third guy. So when I, after having knocked open the door to their hotel room, he was still there, and the cops later claimed I had pretty much broken in during an interview, said Heil Hitler, smacked my boots together, and given them the fascist salute, and demanded to talk to them. I guess that is also a way to look at it. Sigh. They quickly found out that Snorri was the weak link, and they got nothing from either the third guy or me, unbeknown to me who could not care less about what had happened. Snorri was horribly shaken by the whole event. Okay, I killed some asshole who planned to torture me to death. Should I rather have wanted him to kill me? I had done nothing wrong. I slept like a child. Snorri, though, was a wreck. He could not sleep, he could not eat or do anything at all. So the cops put all the pressure on him. They called him for interviews again and again, probably followed him if he went outside, and basically broke him even more. In the end, they picked him up for an interview around 11 in the night, or around midnight, I'm not sure exactly, and Snorri broke down completely. He wept and cried like a baby and kept doing that for more than an hour and a half. He was so broken that they were unable to get anything sensible from him. He just cried. Finally, after an hour and a half or so of crying, he confessed. Something had gone wrong in Oslo, he said, and I had killed Euronymous. They arrested 2 friends of mine, along with me, as we left a club in Bergen around 2 o'clock in the night. When we arrived at the police station, they let one of my friends go, but kept the other one. That was the guy called the third guy in this book. They asked for my name for the records. In defiance, I said, Adolf Hitler. They stripped me naked and threw me into the holding cell. They kept the light on, and people kept walking back and forth, policemen and others in custody alike. I smiled to myself. Is this supposed to break me down? They would get nothing from me. The problem was that they treated the third guy the same way, and he was completely broken by it and confessed to everything, just like Snorri had done. That is, they said nothing about any plans to kill him, but admitted that something had gone wrong in Oslo and I had ended up killing Euronymous. They released the third guy the following day. He talked to Harold, who later on told in police interviews that the third guy had been so relieved to tell the truth to the police, as this secret had been such a burden on all that time. 1 week. So he told them the truth? Remember that. The next day, they threw me a tracksuit and a pair of socks, but no shoes, and I was walked in irons to a civilian police car parked behind the police station in the yard. The lead tactical investigators were there, and they asked me, "How do you handle this?" No. Hvordan takler du det? I answered with silence, and I never spoke to them again. As we started driving, they started small talking to soften me up. but I just ignored them. Would you like something to drink? And I said nothing. Are you hungry? I said nothing. They kept on with similar questions for about an hour until one of them lost it and started shouting and screaming at me and tried to get back to me whilst we were driving. The other two had to physically prevent him from attacking me. He was in the front passenger seat and I was in the seat behind him. I laughed inside of me. Victory. Those motherfuckers would not get any info from me. They had, of course, placed their best tactical investigators in a car with me for a friendly 6 to 8 hour drive to get me to talk. But it failed miserably. When we arrived in Oslo, they placed me in Oslo jail, and I never heard from them again. They had given up already. They did not need me to talk, though. They had Snorri and the third guy who were more than willing to talk and spill the beans. Their problem was that there was zero evidence against me, but plenty of evidence against Snorri having been there. Now, this never even crossed my mind at the time, and it took many years to even understand that this was their worry, but they were afraid that I would put the blame on Snorri. If I had done that, Snorri would have been convicted for this, and I could have walked. That is, unless they did something about that. And they did. They went to the third guy who had already told them what he had described to Harold as the truth, and told him that poor Snorri would be convicted for this unless he gave them some more info. Do you really want to ruin his, Snorri, life for something Varg has done? They did the same to Snorri. Unless he said something to implement me in this, he would be convicted for this crime. Both of them played ball with the cops, and voila. This is the moment they came up with the idea that I had planned to kill Euronymous before I even left Bergen for Oslo. The cops also told the MSM that they had my fingerprints and blood from the crime scene. Now, as the one who was there, I know that they did not, and they just made that up to make sure I would be found guilty by the people, by the media, before I even arrived in court. I guess Snorri told them that I had not worn gloves, so they felt free to make up that lie. When in court, I may add, they never brought up this piece of evidence, I guess because it was fabricated. In the end, when I went to court, they were all prepared for me to blame Snorri, but like I said, the idea had not even crossed my mind. Maybe I was too stupid to come up with such a plan. I would like to think that I simply was not that much of an asshole. What kind of Untermensch would do such a thing anyhow? So when I simply stated in court what had actually happened, like I have done in this book, they were all caught off guard. And note that everything I said and everything I say here in this book corresponds completely with all physical evidence in this case. If anyone ever tries to tell you otherwise, they are lying to you. I told them that he had attacked me and I had ended up killing him. I also told them that I understood that according to the laws and rules of Norway, I had gone beyond my right to self-defense the moment he started trying to run away instead of continuing to fight me, and that legally speaking, I was guilty of what in English is called intentional homicide. That is, you kill somebody but did not really plan to. However, I had, of course, done that in self-defense to save my own life. I continued to make it perfectly clear that Snorri had nothing to do with the case other than the fact that he had by chance was there when it happened. He did not assist me in any way or had done anything at all to do with this killing. The court took a break to the next day. I returned to Oslo jail, and when the other guys heard about what had happened from the radio and TV, they clapped my shoulder and gave me credit for having taken all the blame myself and for having completely talked Snorri out of it. The next day, it was Snorri's turn to give testimony, and yeah. He stuck to the original anti-Varg plan and claimed we had planned the murder. Naturally, the third guy did the same, And perhaps interestingly, he was never even charged with that. So he participated in the planning of a murder and also assisted the murder, but he was not even charged? Very strange. He spent a total of 1 night in custody for that. And no, this is not how it works in Norway. If you commit a crime and get caught for it, you cannot cooperate with the cops to have them drop charges. At best, you can get a reduced sentence, but that is it. So yeah, it is really strange that this guy claimed to participate in the planning of a murder and in assisting afterwards. No. So they both claimed I had planned to murder him, and they had both assisted me in driving me there, providing alibi back in Bergen, and in helping cover it up. I will talk more about the trial later on in this book. In the end here, I will add that the next day after Snorri gave his idiotic testimony, the guys back in Oslo jail were shocked and seriously asking me if the guy was retarded or something. He had basically talked himself out of freedom and into participation to a first-degree murder. What, though, other than what I've already told you about this, made him do that? You see, he had called about 30 medical witnesses who were supposed to testify that he could not do time in prison for medical purposes. So in his mind, he would walk no matter what. He could say all of this because he really believed that he would not have to do time in prison anyhow. Just like what happened to the third guy who spent 1 day in custody for this. One doctor, specialist, and you name it after the other were called to the stand and explained us all about the medical problems of Snorri. He was allergic to pretty much everything, including daylight. He was this and that, he suffered from this and that, and frankly, I'm not even going to tell you about all of these things because they are kind of private. In spite of all of this, though, when I, of course, was found guilty of having murdered Euronymous, he too was found guilty of having participated in the planning and assisted me and was convicted to 8 years in prison. His entire medical corps had been ignored, and he too would have to do hard time. Knowing that, it makes more sense why the two were willing to give false testimony against me, or if you believe in the police version of all of this, why they testified against me even though I had actually cleared them from the case already. The third guy was not even charged with this, so he had nothing to worry about, and Snorri believed wholeheartedly that he was not going to do any time no matter what. When Snorri received his sentence, he was completely broken. He had not expected that at all. 8 years in prison for having done nothing. Karma is a bitch, I guess, at least to some.